What's up, guys? Jay right here coming at you with the first episode of the C10 build series. Today we've got the heavy Chevy in for a heart transplant. We're going to be taking the old 350 out of this beast and replacing her with brand new crate engine from GM Goodrich. Nothing special, just a 260 horse, 350 foot-pound torque engine. This engine comes straight from Chevrolet as a long block. Comes with a 3-year, 100,000 mile warranty straight from GM. You can take it to any dealership, any Chevrolet GM dealership, and have work done to it if you have any problems with it. So that's what we're going to be putting in, and follow along with me as I show you the ultimate C10 engine swap guide. Now, the first thing I like to do when starting an engine swap is to break free the header bolts. So most of the time when these older trucks, things are rusty because they haven't been moved in years. So I have started the truck up, let her warm up for a few minutes just to get some heat in the exhaust, and that's going to help loosen the bond from the rust and hopefully, in theory, help me break these bolts loose. We've got 6 bolts on the header flange here. Those are 7/16, and then I have long tube headers on my truck, so those are going to take 9/16, and there are 3 bolts with nuts on them. So I'm going to break those loose now. Okay, I've got all the exhaust bolts broke loose. It's still too hot to handle, so I'm going to leave them just loose hanging in place there. The next step I'm going to do is disconnect the battery terminal. On a GM side post battery, that is a 5/16. So go ahead, remove that. Alright, next step is going to be start tearing into the front of the engine here with the radiator, the fan, and all the accessories. But a little word to note by here. I've got my truck just pushed out of the garage just a little bit to drain the antifreeze. Even if you have a pan underneath, you're never going to catch it on. You're going to make a mess on the floor. So you've got a couple of options here. If your vehicle is stationary and you don't have a way to move it in and out of the garage while you're doing the swap, it might be a good idea to go underneath right now before you get the floor all wet and messy and disconnect the torque converter bolts if it's an automatic. Get to the starter, disconnect that, and potentially some bell housing bolts. And any other work that you're going to need to do underneath the truck. It's going to be very helpful if you get this done now instead of having to crawl around in a mess of antifreeze and whatnot. Now we need to take off the radiator fan and the shroud. So the radiator fan itself is held on by 4 1/2-inch nuts right there, and the shroud itself has 4 1/2-inch machine screws, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom there. The radiator fan is out. In the process of that, I also had to undo the top radiator hose. It had a 3/8 bolt holding it here, just a flat blade screwdriver clamp. Make sure you have a catch pan underneath because it will spill out just a tad bit of coolant. It's not draining the radiator, it's just a little bit of spill. Now we have to take the fan shroud off. I misspoke earlier, I said 1/2-inch. The fan shroud bolts are 3/8 of an inch. There's 4 of them, 2 on top and 2 on bottom. Alright, rope under the truck here. These 2 bolts, right, machine screws right there, are what you have to get out. A 3/8 wrench is going to work best up in here. Alright, with a little bit of maneuvering past the water pump pulley and the radiator, fan shroud comes off. Now, at this point in time, we're starting to gather a little bit of parts and some bolts and nuts and whatnot. It's very important you have yourself a table, a workbench, something like that to keep all of your parts nice and organized. It's very easy in a swap like this to lose bolts, misplace bolts, things of that nature. Just makes it a whole lot nicer if you stay organized as you go. Bagging and tagging is best. A big table with organization is almost as good. Alright, now it's time to make a mess and drain the radiator. We've got a couple options on how to do that. One would be to use this little plug right here, the drain plug. Remove that and wait for about 10 minutes and let it go. Or you can be a savage and just take the lower radiator hose off. All it takes is a flat blade screwdriver and it'll be done in about 30 seconds. So that's the route I'm about to choose. Wish me luck that I don't get it everywhere. Oh, and gotta be environmentally friendly. Get a catch pan under there. And with the lower radiator hose removed, we have officially made a mess, and it only took about 10 seconds. While that's draining, I'm going to go ahead and remove the radiator supports. We've got 4 bolts, 2 here, 2 here. I believe these are all 1/2 inch as well. Take those out. The radiator is going to move right out once you disconnect the heater hose line, the flat blade screwdriver, and the overflow line with a pair of channel locks or pliers. And with both radiator supports removed, should just lift out of place. Voila, radiator's out. Remove the upper radiator hose, the lower radiator hose, and all of my fuel lines. So we're going to take them loose here, here, and the main fuel line, since it's easier to get to, I'm going to remove mine up here. That should get the hoses out of the way and all the fuel lines disconnected. Alright, now with both radiator hoses removed, all the fuel lines disconnected, I'm going to go ahead and pull my carburetor off, all of my linkages, throttle cable, my kickdown cable for the transmission, throttle return spring, remove all that, get that out of the way so I can bolt the engine lift plate on. Alright, I've got the carburetor pulled off, got the lift plate just temporarily installed, set on there so nothing falls into the intake. Try to keep it nice for the next guy because I do plan on selling this engine used on Craigslist. So next step is going to be to disconnect some random vacuum lines there in the back of the intake manifold. I'm also going to pull off all the plug wires and remove the distributor cap to give us some more room whenever we're pulling this engine out. Alright, got the distributor cap off. Great thing about these square bodies is there's plenty of room to be standing in here working. So, got me a nice comfortable seat here. Gives me a good access at the back of the engine. So now with the cap off, I'm gonna get all of this stuff, linkages and everything kind of tucked up as best I can for right now. And that's gonna give me a chance to remove the oil pressure wiring, disconnect the hold down for the wiring harness in the back, and just disconnect some of these random wires, wiring going to the alternator, the air conditioning clutch, things like that. Okay, so I got all the electrical connections undone from the alternator, the AC compressor, got this wiring harness undone, oil pressure sensor in the back, got everything loose. It's moved, kind of tucked in behind the engine so that whenever we yank it up, it's not going to catch on anything. Now I'm going to shift my attention to the front accessory drive. Now you got a couple different options here. You could just disconnect the power steering lines from the gearbox and disconnect your AC line and then pull everything out as a whole. But because I don't want to have to discharge and recharge my AC system and rebleed my power steering system, I'm going to choose to disassemble the front accessory drive, keeping the AC system and the power steering system intact. Front accessory drive is disassembled. Now it's time to finish pulling out all the header bolts and get them out of the way. Alright, got both of the headers out. Came out pretty smoothly. I actually had better luck getting them out from the bottom than from the top. Your mileage may vary. Now I'm going to jump into the starter. Got to disconnect the wiring. And then there are 2 bolts coming from underneath, bolts to the block. Got the starter off. Came out pretty easy. 2 9/16 bolts from the from the bottom, and 2 electrical connections. One of them, the big one's a 1/2 inch, small one's a 5/16. Gonna have to remove the fuel pump to access this side motor mount. Then all that leaves us with our torque converter bolts, bell housing bolts, support it with the engine hoist, and we'll get this thing yanked out of there. The fuel pump is off. Just takes those 2 bolts right there, comes right out. Next, I'm going to tackle removing the torque converter bolts. Now, if you can see back up in underneath where the starter mounts, see that bolt right there? That is a torque converter bolt. There should be 3 of them. To access the other 2, you're going to have to put a nut on the crank pulley of the engine, spin it over until you see the next bolt, and remove that one. Do that 3 times. And the torque converter will be loose from the flex plate. Once you do that and remove all 3 bolts, that'll make sure that when you remove the engine, the torque converter stays in the transmission instead of pulling out with the engine. Alright, the 3 torque converter bolts are out. The torque converter is free from the flex plate. So with that being done, everything is pretty much disconnected except for we have bell housing bolts left, and we also have the 2 engine mount bolts left. Other than that, the engine's ready to come out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the bolts in the lift plate, run them down tight. I'm going to take this jack here with a piece of wood, and I'm going to support it underneath of the transmission pan so that when the engine and transmission separate, the transmission doesn't take a nosedive, fall, maybe crack an ear or something like that. And I'm also going to take the hood off and set up my engine hoist and get ready to pull this thing out. Alright, so I got a little excited and forgot to pull out the camera, so I'll update you where I'm at. I have removed all 6 bell housing bolts. I bolted up my lift plate to the intake manifold. Took out both side engine mounts. One there. One there. Got it hooked up with my engine hoist. And remember, make sure that your transmission is supported with a block of wood underneath the pan. And with the manipulation of jacking up your engine hoist and rocking this back and forth, you will unseat the engine from the dowel pins of the transmission. And if everything is right and you did everything correct, she'll be hanging free. All I have to do now is take the hood off, fully be able to lift the engine up over the core support, pull her out, and that is a wrap.